For more than a year now, Penn's campus, as well as so many others across the country, have been grappling with issues surrounding free speech and the right to free expression. So not just here in Philadelphia, but we've been asking lots of questions surrounding the ongoing conflict in Palestine about who gets the right to speak, who gets the right to protest, where and when. And this is just one illustrative case. There are examples on both the political left and the political right about these battles over free expression. So, for example, on the right, there are efforts among Republicans to ban critical race theory in colleges and universities. On the left, there are also growing movements to limit hate speech, arguing that it should not be protected as a part of the First Amendment. And it's these very issues surrounding free speech and free expression that are closely tied to the issue at the heart of my dissertation and this talk today, and that's political tolerance. So political tolerance was a concept first defined by Samuel Stouffer in 1955 in his book about communism in the US. He wrote this book asking whether or not we as Americans should feel obligated to extend civil rights and civil liberties to communists and communist sympathizers. So today, when I say political tolerance, I'm referring to a willingness to extend civil liberties to others, regardless of their ideology or political belief. Being politically tolerant means that you're willing to put up with groups that you especially dislike. And I'm not saying that you have to agree or accept these views, but the more politically tolerant you are, the more willing you are to recognize these fundamental rights. So, as the talk suggests, I'm interested in one particular aspect of political tolerance, and that's the way that gender and political tolerance work together. So, there is a significant gender gap in this attitude where women are significantly less likely than men to endorse free expression for their least liked political groups. And this is something that's well documented in existing research. Stouffer's book from 1955 finds this to be true, research throughout the 20th century finds this to be true, and researchers today are showing this pattern exists as well. In fact, in my own research, I can demonstrate that this gap is just as present as it has ever been. So here we can see that in every time point where I ask survey participants about political tolerance, women are lower than men. We have political tolerance here on the y-axis measured from 0 to 1, where 1 is the most politically tolerant you could be. And I've plotted means and 95% confidence intervals, and the fact that those intervals never once overlap suggests that this gap is statistically significant every single time I ask these questions. So this very naturally highlights the research question at the heart of my dissertation and at the heart of this talk today. What explains women's lower levels of political tolerance and unwillingness to extend civil liberties to other groups? Now, some people have tried to answer this question in the past. Women's previous dominance of the domestic sphere is what previous researchers suggested was going on. Researchers thought that because women were typically homemakers, they didn't get exposure to political diversity, and that's what led to their diminished tolerance. Essentially, women were so busy staying home and being housewives, they never got exposed to the political other. And it was this unfamiliarity with other political groups that fostered intolerance. They wouldn't want to tolerate other people because they weren't familiar with them. And this feels incredibly dated to me, so I think we should update it, especially when we consider all of these news headlines that we're seeing that show how well women are doing outside of the domestic sphere. In fact, research is starting to highlight that women now outnumber men in the college-educated workforce. So when we read news headlines like these, I just don't think those previous theories stand true any longer. Instead, I'm going to create a new argument that all centers around the role of threat perception. So it's well known in social science research that women generally are more conflict avoidant than men. They dislike violence. They don't like the use of force. And this, in essence, is a story about what free expression looks like. It's not about gender roles. It's not about socialization. It's all about the image in people's minds. When we ask men and women about what political tolerance looks like, men are more likely to imagine something civil, peaceful, and nonviolent, while women, because they dislike conflict and arguments, are more likely to make that leap to violence and incivility. So we can test this theory. And the logic here is that if women are more likely than men to equate free expression to violence, then if we measure political tolerance in a way that minimizes perceived threat, we should close the gender gap in political tolerance. So This is an example of how we would ask participants about political tolerance. When I survey people, I ask them if there's a particular political group that they really hate. So a lot of times people will say things like racists, fascists, MAGA, or Black Lives Matter. And then I take that group and I pipe it into a bunch of questions like this one. Should members of this group be allowed to speak on a public university campus? Now, presumably, if I add a little more text to the question, like what I have here in red, we could make people feel like this group isn't an immediate threat. Should members of this group be able to speak on a campus if they promise they won't incite violence? So I ran a national survey experiment to test this theory out. I surveyed around 3,000 adults that were nationally representative of the US, and I randomly assigned them to one of those two conditions, whether it was the old version of tolerance or my version of asking the questions. And there are a couple key results here. First, this new treatment significantly reduces threat among women and not men. So I asked these respondents, do you fear that allowing this group to speak up will lead to violence? In the old condition, compared to the new condition, we see that this threat diminishes significantly among women. That gap is marked in pink up at the top. There is no statistically significant change among men. Second, I show that political tolerance also increases significantly among women. So when we measure political tolerance in the old and new conditions, we can see here in pink again, the gap or the amount of political tolerance women shows is significantly higher. It does change among men too, but if we're just looking at the raw p-values here, we see that it increases more among women than it does among men. And finally, the question I'm trying to answer with my entire dissertation is, does the gap shrink? And I'm able to show yes, it does. When we convince women that these political groups don't pose an immediate threat, the gap in political tolerance shrinks. So here in black at the top of this figure, I have the gap noted. It's statistically significant in both instances, yes, but it's smaller when we measure it in this new way. So what does this all mean? Free speech is incredibly important, and I show that the way we ask about free expression matters a ton. When we convince women that these least-liked groups don't pose an immediate danger to them, they appear to be more politically tolerant. So it's not that women dislike free speech and dislike free expression, it's all a story about the image we have in our heads. Women aren't less tolerant, they're just thinking about tolerance differently. And so in my dissertation, I'm continuing to ask these questions, and hopefully in the next year, I'll have some better answers for you. But for now, I'm hoping that this presentation today can convince us all to be just a bit more politically tolerant.